So we're over to Paul. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I'm just going to give a brief outline of the history of the study and where we've got to. And this slide summarizes essentially what we're doing. So this is a very large occupational so-called cohort study where we follow the health of participants up over time, and based on data that we collect on people, when you first joined, and then subsequent data and also linkage to your health records with consent of the participants, we get a picture of the risk for various diseases and outcomes in relation to what we call exposures. And clearly the reason that the study was set up in the first place was that there were questions about whether the use of the Tetra radio system will affect health over the long term. And so that was why it was set up. It was funded initially by Home Office, who funded the study up till March 2016. And during that period, we were able to recruit over 53,000 officers and staff into the study. And most of those people we were able to see in a clinic, and I'm sure that people on this call took part in that, where we did some basic measurements, but also collected blood samples to tell us about the sort of state of health, metabolic health, as well as physical health at the time of recruitment, and then we could follow people up and see what their long-term health trajectory was. And since 2016, we have not been funded any longer by Home Office, and we've had a series of funding from the UK Medical Research Council, from Imperial College itself, and from the National Institute of Health Research through the Biomedical Research Centre at Imperial. And essentially, we broaden, but by necessity, actually, we broaden the question from the initial focus on the use of radio to much more looking at the general health of this cohort of people. And obviously, it's a very special group of people, as you all know, because you are subject to different stressors than the general population. And for example, in relation to the things like PTSD and stuff like that, that we were able to look at that may be particular to this cohort. And then through the data linkage, we're able to find out about cancer risk. Obviously, we're following up people. Some people sadly die over this period, and also looking at people's hospital admissions through the hospital episode statistics, which we get through the NHS. Next slide, please. This just summarizes the initial motivation for the study, that there were possible concerns about the use of the Tetra radio system, and that a long-term follow-up study was required, and that was the origin of the Airwave study. Next slide, please. So this just summarizes how the studies worked. We sent out a questionnaire for people to complete. We invited people into this health screening where we did some physical measurements, but also collected so-called biological samples, that's blood and urine. And then we followed people up through the NHS data systems, as I mentioned, cancers, mortality, and hospital admissions. We also, with consent, linked to people's sickness absence records through their forces, and collected data on the use of the Airwave system by linking to the computerized records that were held at that time by the Home Office. And then we invited people who attended a screening in the first place. We invited people back for a repeat visit so that we could see how people had progressed over time, and collected some more biological samples. And then I'm getting some feedback here. People okay? And then we've also, because we've opened up the cohort for more general research, we share the data in anonymized form or so-called pseudonymized form with a platform, national platform funded by the UK Medical Research Council called DPUK, so that people could apply to access the data through that route and then carry out analyses that are approved by our access committee but allow people to analyze the data remotely from Imperial College. Next slide, please. So I mentioned there were over 50,000 people, around 20,000 women and around 33,000 men. The average age on recruitment was around 40, which is makes it a very interesting cohort study within the UK portfolio. There's a very, very large study called UK Biobank, which has 500,000 people in it, but they were around 15 years older. So we are able to get look at what's happened to people really over their adult life course, because we have some people around who joined the study around the age of 18, and we also have people at the other end of the age scale. So we've got the complete age scale of adult people. And for some diseases, they have their origins quite early in life. For example, diabetes risk or heart disease risk the origins may occur really quite early in life. So we should be able to capture that during the progression of the study. Most people self-reported as being of white European origin, around 5% from other ethnicities. And you can see here, this is percent looking at the ranking of the members of the study. For the female cohort participants, more of them were higher proportion were police staff, but most people were police constable or sergeant. But we do have more senior officers, inspectors, chief inspectors, and so forth. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, we offered a follow-up visit to people who'd taken part in the initial health screening visit. And you can see we're all over the country, in England, Wales, and in Scotland, where we set up these clinics and invited people in for measurements and for taking more blood samples, urine samples. Next slide, please. And then I mentioned these biological samples. These are kept for long-term storage. And then the idea is that if someone develops a disease, we can go back to their original sample and look at the metabolic markers that were present years back that may be predictive of who got disease later on. And that's the essence of this sort of so-called cohort study design, cohort coming from the idea of the Roman legions marching in groups. That's where the idea of the cohort comes, and we follow people up. So we can go back to their samples. We collected physical measurements through the clinics on, for example, blood pressure, grip strength, and we did a electrocardiogram. We have blood and urine samples. We measured cognitive performance using a on-screen test. We've asked people about their food intake through a 7-day food diary. We have a questionnaire on health and lifestyle. We collected information on sickness absence through the employer, as we mentioned. Collected information on treatments and medical history through the questionnaires. Link to the NHS, as I mentioned, for collecting information on outcomes. And then we've also done some measurements on the blood samples, looking at metabolites in the blood, and also looking at DNA samples for a part of the cohort, looking for genetic risk. And then we have information on the airwave use from the network provider through the Home Office, and store the samples. Next slide, please. So our initial focus, as I said, was on use of airwave, and here's some examples of the types of studies we've published. We did do a provocation study looking at whether we could detect any physiological effects of airwave, and that resulted in a paper that we could actually pick up some effects on the electroencephalogram based on stimulation of what we thought was the vagal nerve in the chest. This doesn't have any clinical implications, but it showed that there could be potentially some physiological effects. But we've looked at cancer risk fairly early on in the study, where we had quite a limited number of cancer cases, and we didn't find any association between radio use and subsequent risk of cancer. But this is something that we're going to come back to and do a larger study. And then we also looked at sickness absence, and we didn't find an association there with use of the radio and sickness absence, although there were some interesting associations depending on who had a radio, how their information was reported, and so forth. Next slide. And now, as I say, we've widened the use of the cohort to be really a study of occupational health among the police force, and it is the largest such study anywhere in the world, as far as we know. So we're looking at, we're extending the measurements to include a hearing test, which should be launched later this year, looking at mental health questions, and I mentioned PTSD earlier, looking at cognitive function using online tests, looking at brain injury following trauma, asking people about that. We're very interested in shift work, which is obviously a particular interest within the police force. And we have these metabolic measurements, so-called multi-omic measurements, using the stored blood samples. Next slide, please. And here's just some examples of some of the outputs from the study. This one's looking at diet and risk of so-called cardiometabolic, that's obesity and diabetes and so forth. Next slide, please. This study, we contributed to a study looking at the genetic associations with higher blood pressure, which was a major study of which airways was an important part. Next slide, please. And this one I mentioned, PTSD, depression and anxiety and so forth amongst the cohort. Next slide. Then, of course, something that we might want to discuss later in the meeting, we have very strong governance for the study. The data are all held in a very secure system that is audited. We are subject to sort of top-level information governance, and obviously the whole thing is driven by individual consent. We have a scientific advisory group that we set up with the Home Office, and we're resetting up now with the Home Office as observers, and also we will be asking for a Police Federation rep to be on that group as an observer. This is the Participant Advisory Group. Everything that we do is governed by research ethics, which is a national system of looking at research in the UK. We have a data access committee, which involves Police Federation representative for all the research that's done in the cohort, go through the data access committee. In order to get the linkage to NHS data, we have to go through an approval system with the NHS. as I say, we're subject to external audit of our systems and how we keep the data, and to top level methods of doing that, the so-called ISO 27001. And we need to report clearly our findings, get reported mainly through publications, but also as we apply for more funding, we basically report where we've got to in the study and outputs of the study. And I think, Kirsten, that's the last slide.
One more.
Oh, one more slide on the Data Access Committee. Okay, so the Data Access Committee, as I say, which includes Police Federation representation, considers all applications for use of the data. So far, we've looked at 166 applications to use the data, and around a variety of subjects around things such as healthy aging, cognition, diet, looking also at genetic and metabolic studies in relation to health. People in the cohort very kindly took part in some of the work we did around COVID, and that was very successful. And as I say, we're launching something around hearing as well. And there are 67 publications in the peer-reviewed literature so far that have come from the study. So I think that is the last slide. Is that right?
Yeah. Just one mind, in case the Home Office, find out, they did actually support the study until March 2019 rather than 16.
Oh,
we
sorry,
managed to gouge that out of them.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Andy.